I gave my daughter a house, hoping that it would be her happy home. But that same day, her husband James brought his family, and they forced her to serve them as if she were a stranger in her own home. Their smiles shone with, gloating, but I swore I would wipe it off their faces. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel, and let us know where you are listening in the comments, right? So there I was, signing away half my life savings with a sort of reckless optimism usually reserved for lottery tickets and dating apps. The pen felt heavier than my mortgage payments, which, given I had just sold half my engineering firm to afford this little gesture, was saying something. My daughter, Emily, rang just as I was dotting the final, on what I foolishly assumed would be the happiest day of her life. Her voice came to phone like a wounded bird attempting flight. Fragile, broken, and utterly heartbreaking. "Dad," she whispered, because apparently we were doing dramatic phone calls now. "James says the house isn't what he expected." Isn't what he expected. Because naturally, when your father-in-law sells half his business to buy you a bloody palace, the appropriate response is to complain about the aesthetics. I could practically hear James in the background, his voice dripping with that particular brand of entitled disappointment that only comes from never having worked for anything in your miserable life. Not my taste. You know that. Not his taste. The house I'd spent 2 years researching, visiting, and lovingly selecting based on every conversation Emily and I had ever had about her dream home. But James, found it lacking. Rather like finding fault with a Michelin-starred meal, because it wasn't served in a McDonald's wrapper. The notary, bless her, watched this delightful family drama unfold with the sort of professional detachment that comes from witnessing humanity's capacity for ingratitude on a daily basis. She slid the final documents across the desk with practiced efficiency, probably thinking about her pension and wondering why she'd chosen a career that exposed her to the worst of human nature. I forced myself to sign, my handwriting resembling something a drunk spider might produce after a particularly challenging evening. The office reeked of instant coffee and broken dreams. Or perhaps that was just the fluorescent lighting making everything look like a crime scene. You see, I'd had this rather quaint notion that giving your daughter a house, a proper house, mind you, not some bedsit masquerading as accommodation, would be received with joy, gratitude, even. Call me old-fashioned, but I thought 2 stories in Stamford, complete with the sort of garden that appears in lifestyle magazines, might warrant at least a thank you before the criticism began. But no, James, in his infinite wisdom, had decided that my life's work wasn't quite up to his standards. His standards. The man who considered choosing between takeaway menus a major life decision. 10 years ago, when my wife died and left me with an 8-year-old who drew houses on napkins like other children drew stick figures, I made a promise. Emily would never want for anything. Looking at her sketches, big windows, wraparound porches, gardens bursting with roses, I knew exactly what that anything would be. I'd trusted people then. Business partners who smiled while systematically bleeding my company dry. Friends who vanished the moment I needed them. But this house, this was supposed to be different. This was supposed to be pure. Supposed to be the phrase of the perpetually disappointed. The notary cleared her throat, probably eager to process the next family's descent into dysfunction. "Congratulations, Mr. Collins. It's official." She handed me the deed with the enthusiasm of someone passing along terminal diagnosis results. I tucked it against my chest, right next to where my heart used to live before James took up residence. They're like a particularly virulent form of emotional parasite. The drive to house gave me time to contemplate how spectacularly I'd misjudged the situation. You know that feeling when you realize you've been playing chess whilst everyone else has been playing Jenga? That's roughly where I found myself as I pulled up to what I naively assumed would be Emily's sanctuary. James's car was already there, boot open like the maw of some consumption-obsessed beast, regurgitating boxes onto the pristine driveway. Because nothing says gratitude quite like treating your gift like a storage unit. Emily stood by the door, her smile having all the authenticity of a politician's campaign promise. She rushed to hug me with the sort of desperation usually reserved for people clinging to lifeboats, and I felt her hands trembling like autumn leaves of a storm. "It's yours now," I said, pressing the keys into her palm. They felt heavier than they should have, weighed down by the crushing inevitability of what was to come. She looked at them as though I'd handed her a live grenade, which, as it turned out, wasn't far from the truth that I wasn't present for the actual carnage. Lucky me. But Emily's phone calls painted a picture vivid enough to give Hieronymus Bosch nightmares. Picture this. Your daughter's dream home, the one you've sacrificed half your life's work to provide, being systematically destroyed by people who view hospitality as a competitive sport where the host is always losing. Olivia, James's mother and apparent commander-in-chief of this domestic military operation, had appointed herself chief destroyer of dreams. Her voice cut through Emily's whispered phone calls like a chainsaw through silk. This kitchen's too small. Honestly, Emily, did you even look at this place? Did she even look? Because clearly, when your father buys you a house, the appropriate response is to conduct a detailed structural survey before accepting. How frightfully inconsiderate of Emily not to hire a building inspector before graciously receiving her gift. I sat in my cottage, gripping the phone whilst Emily's voice cracked like ice under pressure. In the background, I could hear the symphony of domestic terrorism, Crash's complaints, and James's laughter, that particularly grating sound that only entitled men produce when watching their wives suffer. Careful, Em, came his voice, dripping with mock concern. Don't break my stuff. His stuff. In her house. The house I'd bought for her. But apparently, marriage comes with some sort of ownership transfer I'd missed in the fine print. The phone calls became a sort of masochistic routine. Emily would ring, her voice getting smaller with each conversation, whilst I sat in my cottage constructing elaborate mental images of the hell she was enduring. Olivia had evidently decided that Emily's role in this charming tableau was unpaid domestic servant with a side of emotional punching bag. Because nothing says welcome to the family, quite like treating your daughter-in-law as though she's personally responsible for every inconvenience in your pampered existence. The coffee's cold already, Olivia would snap, as though Emily possessed some sort of caffeine-warming superpower that she was selfishly withholding. Meanwhile, James sprawled about like a particularly lazy emperor, issuing commands with the casual authority of someone who'd never done an honest day's work. You miss a spot, Em. Don't make my mum do your job. Your job. Because apparently, owning a house comes with an automatic domestic service contract that nobody bothered to mention. I found myself constructing increasingly elaborate revenge fantasies whilst listening to these updates. Nothing violent, you understand. I'm not completely unhinged, but perhaps something involving industrial-strength itching powder and their laundry, or replacing their shampoo with honey. Small victories for small minds. The call that finally broke me came on a Tuesday. Emily's voice had progressed from fragile to completely shattered, and she was crying in that particular way that suggests someone has systematically stripped away every last vestige of self-respect. Dad, I can't do this anymore. They're treating me like I'm nothing. Nothing. The word hit me like a physical blow. This from a woman who'd once argued with contractors about building specifications, who'd been fierce and brilliant and unafraid. Marriage to James had performed some sort of reverse alchemy, turning gold into base metal. Sweetheart, why didn't you tell me sooner? I didn't want you to worry. Didn't want me to worry. Because clearly, the appropriate response to watching your daughter's soul being systematically demolished is casual indifference. How thoughtful of her to spare me the inconvenience of caring about her well-being. Please, Dad, don't come here. It'll make it worse. But sometimes, making things worse is exactly what the situation calls for. 20 years ago, a business partner taught me an invaluable lesson about trust. Specifically, that it's a luxury you can't afford when dealing with parasites. He'd smiled while systematically destroying everything I'd built, much like James was now smiling whilst destroying my daughter. Some lessons, it seems, bear repeating. I drove to the house with the sort of grim determination usually reserved for root canal appointments and tax audits. The keys to my car felt like weapons in my hand, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to hope. The scene that greeted me was precisely as horrific as I'd imagined. Olivia opened the door with that particular brand of smug satisfaction that only comes from knowing you successfully made someone else miserable. Richard, she drawled, leaning against the doorframe like some sort of domestic dictator. What a surprise. Surprise. Because clearly, a father checking on his daughter's welfare is completely unprecedented behavior. How delightfully unconventional of me. I pushed past her into what had once been Emily's pristine living room and was now a monument to casual destruction. Boxes everywhere, wine stains on the furniture, and the general ambience of people who'd never learned that other people's possessions deserved respect. James lounged on the sofa like a particularly lazy Roman emperor, whilst Emily stood in the corner, looking like she'd been systematically worn down by emotional sandpaper. "You need to leave," I said, my voice cutting through their comfortable dysfunction. "This is Emily's house, not yours." Olivia's laugh could have stripped paint. "Oh, Richard, you're so dramatic." Dramatic, because apparently, expecting people not to destroy your daughter's home and spirit is terribly theatrical behavior. This is where things became truly interesting. James, in a display of criminal overconfidence, decided to produce what he claimed were legal documents giving them the right to stay. Property transfer papers. He called them, waving them about like some sort of legal victory flag. The problem with forgeries, however, is that they're rather like bad toupees, convincing from a distance, but absolutely ridiculous upon closer inspection. The papers were too crisp, the fonts inconsistent, and the whole thing had that particular aroma of desperation that only comes from people who think they're cleverer than they actually are. "Those are fake," I said, though my throat felt like it had been lined with sandpaper. James's confidence flickered like a faulty light bulb. "Tell that to a judge. Tell that to a judge." Because naturally, the British legal system is famous for its tolerance of obvious forgeries produced by people who clearly learned their document creation skills from YouTube tutorials. But Emily, bless her, was watching this entire performance with growing clarity. You could practically see the fog of manipulation lifting from her eyes as she realized just how pathetic this whole charade actually was. Linda Russell's office had that particular atmosphere of expensive competence that comes from years of watching people's lives fall apart in legally interesting ways. She slid a folder across her glass desk with the casual efficiency of someone who'd seen this particular brand of domestic terrorism before. "Those documents are fake," she said, her voice crisp as autumn air. "But we need hard proof. Hard proof. Because apparently, obvious incompetence isn't sufficient evidence in our modern legal system. How disappointingly thorough of them." She recommended Mark Wilson, a private investigator with the sort of reputation that suggested he could find skeletons in even the most carefully curated closets. People like Olivia, Linda assured me, always had secrets. Always had secrets. Rather like saying water is wet or politicians are dishonest. Technically true, but hardly revelatory. Mark Wilson met me in Stanford Park under an oak tree, like some sort of suburban spy thriller. The manila envelope he handed me felt light, but as anyone who's ever received legal documents knows, weight and impact are inversely proportional. The photographs inside were wonderfully incriminating. Olivia stepping out of a hotel with a man who definitely wasn't her husband, looking rather more intimate than mere friendship would suggest. "She meets him every Tuesday," Mark said, lighting a cigarette with practiced nonchalance. "Same place. She's sloppy." Sloppy. The word that perfectly encapsulated everything about Olivia's approach to life, from her treatment of Emily to her execution of adultery. If you're going to destroy a marriage, at least have the courtesy to do it with some style. I tucked the photographs away, feeling them burn against my chest like a promise of justice. Olivia's weakness, capturing glossy color, ready to be deployed at precisely the right moment. I returned to the house with Emily beside me, her hand finding mine for courage. The envelope in my other hand felt like vindication made tangible. Olivia opened the door with her usual smug satisfaction, but her expression faltered when she saw my face. Funny how quickly confidence evaporates when confronted with consequences. "You've got 10 minutes to get out," I said, stepping into the chaos they'd made of Emily's home. I tossed the envelope onto the table, letting a single photograph slide out like a playing card in a particularly vicious game. Olivia's face drained of color faster than a bathtub with a plug pulled. "Where did you get that?" she hissed, her voice dropping to a whisper. Where did I get it? Because clearly, the important question when confronted with evidence of infidelity is the methodology of discovery, not the actual betrayal. How refreshingly misguided of her. Doesn't matter, I said, meeting her gaze. It's going online unless you leave. Now. Emily stepped forward, her voice steady for the first time in months. This is my house. You don't belong here. You don't belong here. For simple words that contain more power than all of James's forged documents and Olivia's theatrical indignation combined. James tried one last pathetic rally, waving his fake papers like some sort of legal talisman. But even he could see that the game was up, his mother's composure cracking like ice in spring. Watching them pack was rather like witnessing a particularly chaotic evacuation. Olivia screamed at James with the fury of someone whose carefully constructed facade had just collapsed in spectacular fashion. This is on you, James. You ruined everything. You ruined everything. Because clearly, the problem wasn't decades of entitled behavior, but rather the inconvenient discovery of said behavior. How wonderfully self-aware of her. James dragged boxes to the car with the graceless efficiency of someone accustomed to fleeing the scene of their own disasters. Neighbors had gathered to witness the entertainment, their presence a silent chorus of vindication. Mrs. Larson from across the street crossed her arms and delivered the final verdict. Good riddance. Good riddance. 2 words that perfectly encapsulated the collective sentiment of everyone who'd had the misfortune of encountering James and Olivia's particular brand of domestic terrorism. They drove away with the sort of dramatic tire squealing usually reserved for action films, leaving behind only the faint scent of burnt rubber and wounded pride. 6 months later, Emily and I knelt in her garden, planting roses in soil that smelled of new beginnings. The house behind us gleamed with fresh paint and renewed hope, its windows open to let in the sort of light that only comes after particularly dark storms. These are perfect, she said, her hand steady as she patted soil around a sapling. Her smile was genuine now, no longer the brittle thing she'd worn during those awful months. Inside, the house smelled of baked bread and possibility. Emily's childhood sketches hung on walls that were finally, properly hers. The divorce papers had been signed, the last legal shackle severed. I couldn't have done this without you, she said, turning to face me with eyes that held no trace of the fear that had once haunted them. I pulled her into a hug, thinking of that 8-year-old girl who'd once drawn her dream house on a napkin. I'd sold half my life to make that dream real, and standing there in her garden, surrounded by roses that would bloom for years to come, every sacrifice felt worth it. You're stronger than you know, I told her. I'll be stronger now, she replied, her voice carrying the sort of quiet confidence that comes from surviving your own personal apocalypse. The keys to the house sat on her kitchen table, no longer symbols of hope deferred, but promises kept. The garden stretched around us, patient and eternal, waiting for the seasons to come. And somewhere in the distance, probably nursing their wounds and plotting their next domestic invasion, James and Olivia continued their existence. But that's their story to tell, and frankly, it's not one worth hearing. Right then, if you've enjoyed this delightful tale of family dysfunction and eventual justice, do smash that like button. Subscribe for more stories of human folly, and share your thoughts in the comments. Because nothing quite compares to the therapeutic value of watching terrible people get exactly what they deserve. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have roses to tend and a daughter to be proud of. The world may be populated by absolute disasters masquerading as human beings. But occasionally, just occasionally, the good ones win.